Welcome aboard.
Please give a warm welcome to Axios local Houston reporter Shafaq Patel.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Shafaq Patel. I'm the co-author of the Axios Houston newsletter, where we write about kind of everything from news to culture to business. Just today, we wrote about FEMA and wind jobs, which is kind of relevant to our conversation today. I'm also with Jay Jordan, who will be on the stage later today. But first, I wanted to introduce our first guest here, Dr. Ken Medlock. He is, nice to meet you. He is the Senior Director for Center for Energy Studies at Baker Institute. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah. First, I wanted to address kind of the small elephant in the room. I wasn't really supposed to be on stage with you here today, was I?
Right.
Our Axios climate change reporter, climate reporter, Andrew Friedman was supposed to be here, but he got pulled away for Hurricane Milton coverage, which kind of just brings us to the catastrophic Atlantic hurricane season that we've been seeing this year. People are more and more concerned about climate change. What do we need to do that we're not already doing or not doing fast enough to support the shift away from fossil fuels and towards clean and renewable energy?
Well, I want to address actually two things in that question. And before I do that, definitely prayers are with everybody in Florida. Hopefully people have heeded the warning and are actually getting out of the way of a Category 4 storm. And I was glad to hear Andrew's actually not in Florida. He's just covering it. But what we've lived through in the Houston region just this summer, right? And this is not just about the hurricane season, but the derecho, which, by the way, derechos are not new. They happen quite often. It's just rare that we see one right here. But they're really exercises in resilience, right? So we have to figure out how to build our energy systems, our infrastructure more generally that is vital for economic activity and safety better, so that we can withstand things like this. Because this is not a one-off event. These things will happen again. So we have to actually figure out how to live through them in a much more resilient way. So in many ways, these are exercises in resilience. And I think I was telling you before, this is not the first time that two major storms have hit Florida in a summer, right? This is not a new thing. It's just been a little while. And so oftentimes we, out of sight, out of mind, we forget how important resilience is until we're reminded, and Mother Nature will always remind us. In terms of the second part of the question, what do we do to address climate change? That is a very tough question, right? Resilience, of course, and measures to improve resilience are part of it. That kind of gets into the whole adaptation side of the discussion. But mitigation with regard to CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions is incredibly important. And so in many ways, it's not just about expanding renewables and low carbon fuels and stuff like that. That is certainly part of the equation, but we also have to understand how to do what we do now better, because it's not going to go away in the next 3 to 5 years. Right? We're going to be using these things for a while, so understanding how to do them in a way that is more environmentally friendly is vital.
So how do we do what we're doing now, but better and faster?
Exactly. So that is a really difficult question that everybody in the world is wrestling with. It's not unique to the United States. It's actually, we see some similar sorts of questions and quite frankly pushback to efforts that are expended in Europe, in Asia, in pretty much everywhere on the world. Why is that? That's really fundamentally what you have to understand in order to understand what we need to do. First of all, and I'll say this just very flatly, capital chases returns. So if you ask industry to do X, Y, or Z, if there is no return on investment, they will not be able to do X, Y, or Z. So we have to actually understand how we build markets so that they can actually promote healthy returns so that investors are interested in actually putting money to work to achieve the sorts of goals that we have in front of us. So this is where policy obviously plays a really critical role because it can tilt the playing field to achieve certain outcomes. Things like the IRA, the IIJA, even the CHIPS Act, these are all positive steps in that direction. But to be blunt, we need to do a lot more because there's a long way to go. And without a doubt, by the way, you see this across industry right now with companies retrenching right into what they have historically done, largely because the returns to capital in those spaces are better, right? So we have to figure out how to leverage industrial comparative advantages, legacy infrastructure, so that we achieve the goals ultimately we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and like you said, there's been some movement in the space, the IRA, and locally we're getting the hydrogen hub in Houston, and there's been the local Sunnyside solar project. But when, if ever, do you think clean energy will rival or surpass oil and gas? And what you kind of mentioned the current barriers, but can you talk a little bit about the barriers?
Yeah, so renewables are growing. I mean, I don't know how many of you know this, but in the state of Texas, there's more wind in this state than any other state in the country. More solar now. It actually eclipsed California, became #1 this year. Battery capacity is growing faster here than anywhere else in the country. All that is phenomenal, but it's important to point out that they still collectively make up a relatively small fraction of total energy use, even in the state of Texas. So, we've still got a long way to go. Will they eventually eclipse? I don't know. The one thing I can certainly say is that when it comes to oil, for example, the lighter ends of the barrel are oftentimes pushed into chemical production and the petrochemical space more generally, right? And this is where you talk about crude into materials. So literally almost everything that is around us in this room, there's a touch point with a barrel of crude oil. So it's not going to go away anytime soon. That ultimately makes this a chemistry and chemical engineering problem. So the question about oil and gas going away, I don't think that's actually the right question. It's actually how are we using it, right? And I think as we go forward, we're going to continue to see that demand for materials remain in place because quite frankly, you can't do solar, you can't do wind, you can't do batteries without those materials. So they are actually fundamental to an energy transition, however we want to define that. So it's really, I think, more about combustible use of hydrocarbons. How do we actually, A, make those more efficient, but B, think about reducing them so that the carbon footprint of these energy sources is actually diminished relative to other things. And so it's a long way off. It's not 5 years from now. It's probably more in the order of 2 decades, which is why I come back to kind of this all of the above strategy. We've got to think about resilience. We've got to think about, doing what we do now better and actually accelerating the shift towards cleaner sources of energy all at the same time.
Zooming into Houston, we know that Houston has crowned itself as the oil and gas capital and the energy capital. How do you see Houston's role kind of changing? There's been a push for clean energy, right? There's been a push to do all of this. How are startups kind of working with the oil and gas giants, and how are oil and gas giants kind of changing what they're doing? So the sort of innovation space around energy in Houston has radically expanded in the last decade. In fact, with the immersion of Greentown Labs, the expansion of the ION over at Rice, the continued growth and outreach of, like Schlumberger's labs or SLB now, Halliburton Labs. There's a lot of stuff going on in the innovation space around energy that is really promising. And so Houston has really taken a leading role in that part of the discussion, not just in the US, but globally. So much so that you have international contingents, ministry level delegations that are coming to Houston. And when they come to Rice, they often do go to the ION. They go visit Greentown Labs. It's a well-known commodity. So it's really promising. It's exciting. The most interesting thing about that is how are those things funded? Well, it's got a heavy footprint from the legacy industries that are in the Houston area, so the oil and gas space. That's not going to change because when you look out, ultimately these companies all view themselves as energy companies, and they're going to try to capitalize on what they can do best and actually make money,
right? Turn a profit. So it's really vital for them to be in that innovation space and providing seed funding for that TRL level 1 to 3 kind of technology, so technology readiness level, things that are sort of still in the lab, not really ready for commercialization, so that they can migrate them into that 4, 5, 6 space and then begin to do pilots and try to scale things so that ultimately they can pick up the options that are going to be commercially very successful. So that's where you get the TRL 7, 8, 9. So they're heavily involved, and so they have radically changed the way they're approaching that innovation space over the last 10 to 15 years, and you see that wholeheartedly right here in the city of Houston.
Yeah. You mentioned Greentown Labs. If I'm not mistaken, the Houston Chronicle reported that when the CEO stepped down, he alluded to some friction points between startups and oil and gas. So can you tell me about if there is friction, or if how much effort or energy are the giants putting in Houston?
So yeah, I'm not aware of any externally focused friction. There might be, internal friction related to somebody thinks their idea is great, but a commercial entity doesn't necessarily think that's what the solution is. And I wouldn't necessarily call that friction. I would just call that reality.
Okay.
Right? Anytime you get into a discussion around innovation, there are going to be winners and losers. That's always going to be the case. Ultimately, what you want to try to do, though, in the innovation ecosystem is develop things that can leverage legacy assets and actually propel with a low fixed cost barrier to entry themselves into success. Great example, and I know there's going to be some talk about this later, is hydrogen, right? So the hydrogen space is actually set up very well because the ecosystem already exists in Houston. So there's a backbone here that actually can be expanded upon.
Okay, kind of going on a tangent here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about AI. Obviously, that's been very big, even with a simple Google search, AI options show up. Are you concerned about how AI could put a strain on our grid? And is clean energy kind of prepared to meet the demands without using fossil fuel?
So AI, data center expansion, this is a very hot topic in the news. I think some of the concerns are a little bit overstated because I think there are efficiencies in the system that will be capitalized upon to minimize that load increase. That said, load is going to grow. Right? There's going to be much more electricity demand that's focused on those activities. And so you ultimately have to figure out how do you continue to reduce the carbon footprint of generation and at the same time meet an accelerating load. That's a tough proposition. So yes, it's going to create issues. And right out of the gate, it's going to be really difficult for data centers that are being built today to do this 100% renewables. They will ultimately either have to be grid connected or have behind the fence generation, so generation that is site specific, that is not wheeling out into the grid so they can manage their own load and do it in a stable way. By the way, this is not unique to data centers, right? This is actually going on with a lot of large industrials who are concerned about reliability because, I'll give you an example, Dow actually contracting to put a small modular reactor at their facility just south of here in the near future. What is that about? Well, it's about reliable service. And for a chemical plant, if your power goes out, it's not just a profit and loss issue, it's actually a safety issue. So, these are things that are very much in the focal point of ERCOT, of the Public Utility Commission, of investors in the power space. So yes, it looks like there's a lot of issues to deal with, and there are, but with every challenge comes an opportunity. So there will be commercial actors that step into that space very rapidly.
Yeah, you briefly mentioned the IRA in the beginning of this conversation. Can you talk a little bit about how the IRA has, the impact the IRA has had in Texas in terms of bringing dollars to the region?
Yeah, so there's still a lot of unknowns with the IRA, largely because some of the tax credits guidance has not been finalized. Right, so probably the one that is on a lot of people's minds most sort of heavily in this area is related to hydrogen, so 45V, right? So this is the tax credit for low carbon hydrogen. The fact that guidance hadn't been finalized and the fact that the initial guidance that was proposed is not very good. I don't know how else to say that, right? It leads to people that are investing in that space to hit the brakes because they actually don't know what the financial platform for their proposed projects will ultimately look like. So it's going to be critical for policymakers in Washington to ultimately, and this is really about guidance, so it gets down to Treasury, ultimately define that guidance in a way that actually does propel some of these newer low carbon hydrogen production assets into being. So there's still a lot of work to do. In other words, yes, it's legislation, so it's on the books. Ultimately, it's about how that guidance is defined. And interestingly, we're going to have a new president. So depending on what that looks like, either way, there is latitude for either one of them to unwind guidance, even if it does move forward, simply because there are things that can be done through congressional intervention, right, to overturn guidance if it was adopted within a certain time frame of an election. And interestingly, if that happens, it's going to inject even more uncertainty because whatever ultimately comes out of the agencies after that can't look anything like what was originally proposed. So we could be looking at 180 days to 365 days of uncertainty, which is just going to further delay a lot of these investments.
We're almost out of time here, but I did want to end on something a little bit more exciting. What technologies or what are you most excited about when it comes to the clean energy transition?
Honestly, it's electricity storage. And I'm not going to pick a winner here, but electricity storage has always been the holy grail in electric power. And if we can figure out how to do that through long duration vehicles, it's going to proliferate very rapidly. It will be game changing in terms of how we see investments matriculate into our power grid. And as a result of that, be utterly transformational inside of 2 decades. So you're really talking about, at least in my mind, a technology that is truly transformational with regard to how we generate power and ultimately manage the grid.
That's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Dr. Medlock, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Introducing our View from the Top moderator, Jason Spowles.
Good morning, everyone. I am Jason Spells. As you know, our event this morning would not be possible without our sponsor, the American Chemistry Council. So with that, I would like to welcome up the president and rather CEO of the American Chemistry Council, Chris John, and Ascend Performance Materials President, CEO, Phil McDivitt. Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Phil. Good morning. Great conversation we just heard, right?
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Chris, I want to start with you. This is the ACC's 3rd time sponsoring an event with Axios right here in Houston. What keeps you all coming back?
So, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, right? But as was said in the last panel there, Houston, our energy capital, and also the epicenter of the biggest state in terms of chemical production in the country. So, we need to get D.C. and Houston aligned on some key priorities going forward. Things like advancing safety, reducing emissions, and driving innovation and economic growth in our country. So just as Phil and some of our other board members spend a lot of time in DC advocating for policies that will drive that economic growth and innovation and job creation, I spend a lot of time here in Houston engaging with the local community and talking about issues that matter here. And we're really fortunate to have champions of our industry in both parties. A little talk about the election there previously. And we've got Congresswoman Fletcher coming on shortly to talk about some of the key challenges and issues that she faces in terms of getting good policies for our industry. So that's why I'm here.
Phil, I know you all with Ascend do a great corporate citizen here in Houston, but we heard Chris bring up DC, and I know you travel to DC often. What do you want those in DC to know about what you all are doing here?
Well, first, as was mentioned earlier, the reality is that everything that we have around us is somehow tied to our industry. So number one is we're an essential part of everything that we have and everything that we do. That's number one. Number two is that we're an industry of of innovators and problem solvers. So when you think about the challenges that have been mentioned around climate change, and we're going to be the ones as an industry to help to solve those problems. And then from an Ascend standpoint in particular, we like to talk about, number one, the solutions that we're providing, whether it's going into EVs or solar, those types of applications, but then also what we're doing as a company in particular, which is our commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2030. And we're well down the path of being able to do that. And I think that Ascend is reflective of all the companies in our industry who are really focused on how to bring the right solutions and do it with the lowest environmental impact and the best carbon footprint.
Chris, how are ACC members doing in terms of reducing GHG emissions and emissions at large?
Yeah. So building off of Phil's answer here, so all ACC members are required to go through an independent third-party audit on their safety and environmental performance. And so the way that program works, it's called Responsible Care. And what they do is we collect a variety of metrics in regards to their performance. We aggregate that data, and then as an association, we share that publicly. You can go to our website today and get that information. And so that allows us to make sure that the communities in which we operate understand that our members are making significant progress on some of these issues. So for example, I can share with you this morning, even though our industry is growing in this country, we've reduced our greenhouse gas intensity by nearly double digits over the last few years. We've reduced our nitrous oxide emissions by 18% as an industry, our sulfur oxide emissions by over 43% during that same amount of time. So we're really proud of our track record and the progress we've made. And the only thing that would make that better is if we got every single chemical company in the country to join ACC and to participate in a program that requires the accountability that Phil and our other members have to comply with, and then we could make even more progress more quickly.
Yeah, if you're a chemical manufacturer that's working to reduce your emissions, improve safety, make sure you join the ACC, and their Responsible Care program can help set you on the right path. Phil, we've been talking about emissions. I want to key in on this. What opportunities do you see that can help with Ascend and you all can continue to help succeed overall as far as reducing emissions?
So first, I had the honor of participating in the White House Summit on emissions reduction here just a few weeks back. And I do want to say, and it was spoken about earlier, that the government, the IRA, is a good way to incentivize companies to accelerate their carbon footprint reduction. So that's certainly a piece, and we certainly are happy about that. I'd say the second area is around a voluntary carbon offset market, which again, the Biden administration actually has come out in support of. Having a carbon offset market allows us and other companies to identify ways to get a return through supporting by getting the support of other companies who maybe are in tougher or more difficult areas to abate. It allows us to accelerate our investments. And again, for us, we're looking at achieving a 90% reduction of both our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And certainly a voluntary carbon offset market that is managed and has good oversight would be a positive. I'd say the third thing, and this has to do with us in North America and certainly in the US, is the third thing that I told John Podesta was around having a level playing field. So I think we're doing a lot of the right things here in the US, and certainly they're happening in Europe. We just want to make sure that there's a level playing field on a global basis, so that the companies that we compete against from other parts of the world also are striving and achieving a lower carbon footprint.
Chris, I know you wrote an article in the Washington Times recently discussing the importance of policy when it comes to sustainability. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, so maybe I'll build off of Phil's answer here in regards to, in the last panel we heard a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and some of the investments that our government is making in reducing emissions over time. As the chemical industry is energy intensive, it's very hard to abate, it's very expensive. So these government investments can help us make progress on that journey. At the same time though, we need to have government policies that enable that to happen. So, and what I mean by that is, the Biden administration's EPA right now is coming out with a number of rules that is prohibiting that progress, banning chemistries that actually go into the projects that Phil's talking about. Our members have received grants or loans for over 20 projects worth over $4 billion. And so we're going to make that progress. The left hand has to know what the right hand is doing in terms of policy, so we can enable that progress going forward, so that we have that level playing field and we don't drive jobs and innovation to countries like China, and we keep it here in the United States.
Couple questions before we wrap up here. Chris, what's one big thing you want this audience to know when they walk away from here today?
I'd say the one big thing that I'd want you to take away from today is that this is not your grandfather's chemical industry. Through 35 years of progress through responsible care, our industry is cleaner, safer, healthier, more productive than it has ever been. We're very proud of that progress, and that ethos of continual improvement through responsible care is going to drive the next 35 years as well. So Houstonians should be really proud that they live in an area where the businesses in the community take their responsibilities very seriously, and they're driving global change and global progress. And that's why we say that American success relies on American chemistry.
And Phil, what's one big thing you can share about Ascend and what the company, the culture is doing with the community here and across the country?
So we operate the company with 5 core values, and one of those values is we care. And operating a company, running a company, is more than about the products that you make. It's actually ultimately about how you positively impact people's lives, and that goes beyond the products. So as a company, we have a social responsibility. I think that's why we've been on the forefront with regards to what we're doing around sustainability. But what we actually do in our communities and how we give back to make the places where we employ people, where we're part of the community, make those places better. And so we're very proud of. We have over 1,600 of our employees volunteer, 18,000 plus hours, put over $2 million into our communities last year, and that's a fundamental part of who Ascend is, and what I think is a fundamental responsibility for all companies is to make the places where we are better, because all you have to do. Go around Houston, you see so many people who are far less fortunate than we are, and we have a responsibility to try to help those people, again, beyond just the products that we make.
Quickly, I want to double back off that Ascend Cares. What is it like for your employees and your members when they see the success of Ascend Cares? What does that do for them?
Well, look, number one is it gets people out of the office. It gets people working together on something that's not business related. So that's tremendously fulfilling. We work with Loaves and Fishes right over here. I mean, it's incredible to feed 300 homeless people, people who clearly don't have even the most basic things. I mean, so it's incredibly fulfilling, and it goes way beyond just the products that you make as a company. So that's why we're so excited, and it's quite honestly, it's also fun to do.
So we're getting the hook now, but everyone got to thank Chris John, Phil McDivitt, ACC, Ascend Performance. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Everybody stay tuned. We have much more coming in.
Please welcome to the stage Axios Houston reporter Jay Jordan.
Hi, everybody. Hello, everybody. I'm Jay. I'm one of the co-authors of the Axios Houston newsletter. If you're here, you probably heard about it through our newsletter. If not, please do subscribe. We have a lot of great information, and I'm really excited to welcome Houston's own Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher.
Good to see you.
Right. So we are here talking about clean energy. And just as a big picture item, to you, what is the federal government's role in promoting the clean energy transition?
Well, obviously, first of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you for having this conversation here in Houston, the energy capital of the world. Super exciting to see so many friends out in the audience and to be a part of this conversation. And certainly this is an important conversation that we are having in Washington, and I feel as a representative from Houston, serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee, I have a particularly important role in bringing our voice to Washington about what our energy future looks like. And what you see here in Houston is that people are thinking about our energy future, new technologies, thinking about how we do the things we want to do. How are we going to reduce emissions? How are we going to address the very real challenges that we are experiencing here, right? And I think sometimes people don't have that impression of Houston or Texans. So I think it's really important to really engage in Washington and be a part of the solution and bring the great ideas that are coming out of this community. I do think, obviously, to answer your question, the federal government has a hugely important role in setting energy policy and in sort of directing bringing our values and our priorities into the conversation about what we want our energy future to look like, and then helping facilitate that. And certainly we know, of course, all of the permitting, all of the things that are happening are involved with, the federal government has an important role to play.
Absolutely.
And so we really need to be engaging in Washington and thinking ahead. And that's why I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation and to be bringing this Houston conversation to Washington.
Yeah, so speaking of the Houston conversation, what has, I know that the IRA, we've talked a little bit about that today. How has that impacted Houston in terms of the transition, the clean energy transition?
It has a huge impact here in Houston. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with many of the provisions of the IRA, but it really is incredibly forward-looking, and it's a great example of really trying to tackle climate change and our climate challenges in ways that are constructive and useful and to reduce emissions. But what we see coming out of the IRA, Houston is in a great position in terms of the investments coming out of the IRA. I think we're expected to have around like $66 billion of investments. There are already, I think, 25 projects that have been announced that are IRA related here in Texas. And there's a ton of both private investment and public investment in these projects, and it's coming here to Houston. Of course, we have about 11% of the country's energy workforce here in Houston, and so this is a natural fit for so much of the innovation, and that's been happening here all along. I mean, it's one of those things where there's a ton of energy technology being developed and that has been developed here over the years, but because it's not your iPhone in your pocket, people don't think about that technology in the same way. It's not consumer driven in the same way, but I think that so much of what has been happening here makes it possible for us to capitalize on this moment and really move some of these IRA projects forward here in a really unique way.
Absolutely, yeah. So Houston, oil and gas mecca. I grew up in the suburbs. I had family working in the industry for years. It's kind of who we are. It's built into our identity. But at the same time, today we're seeing a lot of new clean energy startups. We talked about Greentown Labs that hosts a bunch of startups and companies. How do you feel Houston is hospitable to industries that kind of buck the industries that Houston was built on?
Well, it's interesting. I think you see actually a lot of that same work is in collaboration with some of those industries. I think when you look at some of the players here in Houston that are players on the global stage, they share the same concerns, right? A lot of folks in the industry, most of the folks in this industry obviously are scientists and they believe in science and they are experiencing the effects of climate change and they want to be part of the solution. That's certainly true of the people that I represent in the 7th Congressional District, who are always coming to me with ideas and concerns and wanting to be a part of the solution. And so I think that what you see in terms of the environment here and kind of the ecosystem for startups and for alternative technologies is, you see that some of the super majors are investing in them, right? They're doing their own research. They're also partnering and collaborating at some of the folks in Greentown Labs. I know I've talked about it. That Rice has their their alliance. There are, I think, like 5 or 6 different incubators here in Houston that are working on really kind of making that collaborative environment where those things can happen. And so I do think this community is a great place. And I think that that's pretty much who we are as Houstonians. In fact, when Secretary Granholm came here, she came to Houston. It's her first trip as the Secretary of Energy because this is the energy capital of the world. And of course, this was fitting for this to be the first place that she came. And what I explained to her that I think is really true is we really have a culture of innovation here. And I personally like to point to the Astrodome as evidence of that. I know that's controversial, but you know, we can do anything, right? If we put our minds to it in this town. I think that's very much kind of the Houston view. It's built on a swamp right here. We're right here at Allen's Landing at this moment. We were talking about that a minute ago. And this is a place where if you can visualize it, if you can dream it, you can build it, and we welcome people to come be a part of that from across the country and around the world. And I think that's very much the ethos in Houston. So it's a welcoming place for people. I think it's a welcoming place for innovators. And I think that we're going to see that Houston continues. It's a big part of my job to make sure that Houston continues to be the energy capital of the world because we're doing all of these things. And we already know that Texas has the most diversified electric grid, that we've been investing for years in, large utility scale solar and wind and other things that make this sort of incubator a really good place for us to be trying all these things out.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think Houston's a great place for the genesis of a lot of this stuff. So kind of shifting to your work in Washington, it was last year you refiled the RISE Act. And it's currently in a committee. I think it's been there for a little over a year. Can you explain what this does? It's a bipartisan bill, and why it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about the RISE Act, and we are working on trying to get it over the finish line by the end of this Congress at the end of the year. But the RISE Act is the Reinvesting in Shoreline Economies and Ecosystems is the full name of the bill. And it is bipartisan, it is bicameral. We have great leadership in the Senate and in the House, and we've built, I think, a really strong coalition of a lot of coastal folks, but a lot of other folks too. And the goal is to do really sort of 2 principal things. One, it will help generate sort of interest and I think investment in clean energy projects offshore, because part of what it does is redirects the funds that right now from offshore wind development go directly to the Treasury, reallocating a portion of that to the states, and to use that funding, at least in part, for coastal restoration and doing some of these massive projects that we know we need as we respond to climate change along our coast that we don't seem to have funding for, and that's certainly a challenge. When I have a different hat on, I'm talking all about our infrastructure and the Texas Coastal Spine Project, and of course all of the infrastructure needs we have when it comes to flooding and storm surge. And so one of the things this will do is create a dedicated stream of funding to do those kinds of projects. And of course, I'm sure all of our minds in this room and everybody who's watching is watching Milton across the Gulf today and thinking about everybody in Florida. These coastal communities are really feeling the impacts of climate change. So what we hope to do with this is create this dedicated stream of funding that is really going to help these coastal resilience projects. The other thing that it does is something we've been trying to do for a long time, and I say we, by we I mean people before me and now me, addressing the GOMESA caps and bringing more, lifting the caps basically, and bringing more money to the state.
Affects operations in the Gulf of Mexico, correct?
Affects operations in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's not really operations, it's just we have a revenue cap, so the states, coastal states get a share of the revenues of the royalties from offshore oil and gas production, but they are capped, unlike the interior states that have onshore production. They don't have the same cap, and they don't actually have the same percentage share, but we're just trying to lift the revenue cap so that those funds, in Texas, we tend to hit the cap around August every year. So that's a lot more money that could be flowing into the state to do these kind of coastal restoration and other projects.
Absolutely.
So those are 2 of the big things in the bill. There's really a benefit to everybody in incentivizing these projects and also in protecting our coastal communities.
Yeah, and you had mentioned Hurricane Milton. I believe the latest projections that it's supposed to be a Category 3 or Category 4 when it makes landfall near Tampa. And what's interesting about that is that the direct hit to Tampa kind of pushes a lot of the storm surge into Tampa Bay, and that's going to inundate, that's what the experts are saying, inundate the inland Tampa area. In Houston, if we were to get a direct hit from a hurricane up Galveston Bay, we'd face the same issue. You know, that's why Coastal Spine Project, like you had mentioned earlier, is something that, you know, we need to pay attention to. In terms of, you know, speaking of Milton, but in terms of getting this RISE Act passed and even increasing funding for FEMA for these disasters this year, because they're quickly running out of money. Speaker Johnson said this week he doesn't plan on calling the House of Representatives before Election Day. Is that something that you see changing, or something that, you know, you kind of hope would be different?
Well, I hope it would change. Just last week, I led a letter to Speaker Johnson and Leader Jeffries and the chair and ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, asking to pass a disaster supplemental as soon as possible. And I would be happy to go back to vote on that. It does take time to put it together, but certainly we've been working on it. The president requested supplemental funding months ago before Hurricane Beryl, so it's important to us that we look at the damages from Beryl, that we look at the damages from Hurricane Helene, which has just been devastating, that we look at Milton, and that we do everything we can to replenish the funds. I do think, in our experience here, unfortunately, we are all too familiar with hurricanes and the impacts, and of course, having had two presidentially declared disasters in our community earlier this year, we know how difficult it is to rebuild. And one of the things I'm really proud of, and I'm frustrated by sort of the misinformation that's out there, I think one of the things we've seen in our community is that we've worked together with this administration to improve disaster response and disaster recovery, and FEMA and SBA are working together in ways that they haven't before. SBA has been phenomenal. We have a Houstonian in charge of disaster recovery at SBA right now. But they have really streamlined a lot of the process to help people who are recovering from these disasters. But they have to have the money. They have to have the resources to do it. Congress appropriates that money. If we could go back and do it, I would, and I think that we should. Certainly, I hope that we will be able to move a package as quickly as possible after November. And so we had a bipartisan letter from our Texas delegation reminding the appropriators that there have been so many disasters, including Beryl here in Houston. And of course, we had the flooding and the derecho before that. So it's really time, and these agencies have done an exceptional job in helping us with our recovery and learning from the past, learning from Harvey, applying those lessons, and really improving what they can do for all Americans. But they need us to give them the money and the resources to be able to do it in Congress.
That's a really good point. We're running out of time, but lastly, I wanted to end on a more positive, you know, optimistic note. What are you excited about in the next 10 years in Houston in terms of clean energy?
Oh gosh, okay, that's a big question. I think there's so much to be excited about that's happening here, and I would say one of the things. I mean, certainly, I've been involved with the federal investments and the hubs. You know, supporting the hydrogen hub coming to Houston, supporting all of these different things that I think are really going to be just huge for the future, not just for our community but for the country. I think that. I think the leadership that we see coming out of Houston, and I think the engagement and sort of bringing everybody together, which is, I also think, a very typical sort of Houston way of doing things, right? We want everybody at the table. I think that we can really lead in thinking about how we move forward into our energy future, and we've seen that. We've seen it from the Center for Houston's Future. We've seen it from the partnership. We've seen it from a lot of folks who are really bringing together the major players, the thought leaders, academia, and others, bringing everybody together. I no longer serve on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee because I got a spot on the Energy and Commerce Committee. But one of the things I always used to say when I was on that committee was every hearing we had somebody from industry, somebody from government, and somebody from academia testifying and talking about the ways that they work together. And I think that we have a real opportunity to expand and grow that here in Houston with the programs, with these incubators we're seeing, with the effort, certainly Rice University's in the 7th Congressional District, so I work a lot with Rice, and of course University of Houston has a lot of great stuff going on. So there's just that, all of the pieces are here to really drive the entire conversation for the country and the world forward, because what we're doing here, will determine what happens around the world. And I think we've set our sights and our priorities on reducing emissions, tackling climate change, and doing it in a way that's going to last. So it's not a positive note, but I will say it this way. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is that energy policy has become politicized and is being used as a wedge issue. And I don't think we can afford that. We need to bring everybody to the table, and we need to have people talking about policy that will be durable and that will last from Congress to Congress, administration to administration, so that the people who are doing this work can rely on it. Yeah. And I think that that's how we do things here in Houston. So what I'm excited about is to see Houston lead the way forward.
Perfect. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thanks so much. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. All right, so now we have our final guest of the morning. Brett Perlman is the Managing Director for the Center of Houston's Future and focuses on hydrogen.
Yes.
Nice to see you, Brett. Okay, so kind of in the same vein, what is the importance of hydrogen to Houston in terms of the energy transition? And not all of us are scientists and interested in or super understanding of how hydrogen works. How does it work? And why should we care?
Sure. So just 8th grade chemistry here. I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm going to give you the 8th grade version of this. I'm
That's
sure
perfect.
There's other people who could be more sophisticated. But hydrogen is the first element on the periodic table. It's the lightest element. It's the most prevalent element in the universe, and it has, as Bill Gates says, many applications in the energy transition. So it's been called the Swiss Army knife of the energy transition. So it is very flexible. It can be used as a fuel. It can be used as a carrier for energy. It can be used in, it can be combusted if you want to do that. So it's sort of a transition fuel. You can make what people call e-fuels out of it. You can use it in fuel cells. You can use it to decarbonize industry. And the way we use hydrogen today is in industrial applications to desulfurize oil and gas. So hydrogen is really this thing that's going to be one of the tools in the toolkit, not the only tool, because we have lots of other tools, batteries, wind and solar, but it's a very important tool that we're going to need to decarbonize our energy system. Yeah. So that's why we get excited about hydrogen, and we kind of geek out on it, even though none of us are scientists or chemists.
Yeah, I was reading up on this last night. I didn't use the word cramming, but it was just fascinating stuff to me. And so we talked a little bit about the Hydrogen Hub earlier.
Yeah.
What is the Hydrogen Hub, and what does it matter?
So one of the things about hydrogen that's interesting is that in order to use it for an energy transition tool, you have to be able to produce it cost effectively, you have to be able to move it, and you have to be able to consume it. And so what a hydrogen hub is formally is its production and demand in close proximity, and then combined with some sort of connective infrastructure. That can be pipelines, it can be fueling stations, it can be terminals and bunkering facilities, it can be lots of other things. So in Houston, we are fortunate because of our heritage in the energy industry to produce on the Gulf Coast about 1/3 of the hydrogen in the country. And so we are already a hydrogen hub. We have the production of hydrogen here. We have the biggest pipeline network that's dedicated to hydrogen, 1,600 miles of dedicated hydrogen pipelines. And we have a lot of sophisticated customers who use hydrogen in industrial uses today. So we already have all the elements to become a hydrogen hub and to sort of accelerate the development of this. What we're not today is a clean hydrogen hub. And what do I mean by that? So the way we produce hydrogen today, a little, again, simple 8th grade chemistry, is we take methane, CH4, we combine it with steam, H2O, and we get two things. We get hydrogen and we get CO2. And so when this industry started, the chemists who created this this production method, which we call steam methane reforming, really weren't thinking about the CO2. And so hydrogen today, the way it's produced, produces a lot of CO2. And in fact, it produces about a quarter of our industrial emissions. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity, because it's an opportunity because if we can clean up that hydrogen, then we can use it in all these different applications I was describing before. And so it really is this opportunity basically to take an existing industry and morph it and transform it into something very, very different. That will be a tool, not a liability here. And so that's why we at the Center for Houston's Future, when we were thinking about what contribution could we make as an organization to the energy transition, we didn't really see anyone focused on this. And it was literally the $20 bill on the ground, that this was a huge opportunity that no one had picked up for how you take something that we use today that creates a lot of CO2, transform it into something, clean it up, transform it into something new, and then use it in lots of different ways. And so our vision was that we can use hydrogen to decarbonize our industry, to grow jobs and GDP in our economy, and then basically to help to decarbonize the rest of the world. And so that was what we started down this path of doing it, and along came the bipartisan infrastructure law with $8 billion to do this. And so we said, wow, now we have a funding source to go do that.
$8 billion in federal funding sounds like quite a bit. I bet you can do a lot of damage with that. But what kind of roadblocks are there still, and what additional resources could be procured for this transition to more clean hydrogen production?
Yeah, I think, well, first let me just explain. The $8 billion was basically a pot of money the DOE had from the bipartisan infrastructure law to incent the development of at least 4 hydrogen hubs. And so we submitted, the center along with the GTI Energy and the University of Texas Austin put together a coalition to assemble a group of companies. We have 7 companies in our coalition to put in a grant application for that money. And last year we were awarded the hub was $1.2 billion.
Amazing.
And, but the most interesting thing about that is the private sector investment will be probably multiples of that, 5 or 7 times even higher. So when I talk about, this is $1 billion, what we're really talking about is this, 5 to 7, maybe $10 billion economic opportunity for our community that brings along jobs and GDP. So you asked about the challenges here. This is, energy is tough. It's tough to create new industries. In my prior life, I was on the Public Utility Commission when we deregulated the electricity industry. And, 20 years later, that all looks like, we were successful, at least in creating these new markets for renewables and for solar and wind and for now gas generation. But that didn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of hard work to do that. And so we're going to have challenges in creating this new hydrogen ecosystem. We have to make sure that we're bringing along our communities, that we're reaching out to frontline communities where these assets are going to go. We need to make sure we have the workforce that's trained to do these new jobs. We need to make sure that we have the supply chain, the companies that can service this industry. And Congresswoman Fletcher mentioned some of those issues, the supply chain in particular, about how we're an energy manufacturing sector. A lot of those companies that manufacture today aren't thinking about this new industry, and so we have to educate them on why they need to be involved in that. So those are some of the things that we're doing at the Center for Houston's Future, is to make sure that we do have the workforce, that communities are engaged, that we do have the supply chain, so that as we start to build this industry, we can build not only the projects themselves, but all the pieces that need to support, what I call the ecosystem that go along with it.
Yeah, and you mentioned community engagement in terms of building new industry, and I don't want to frame fence line communities as a challenge to transitioning into more clean energy production. But what kind of importance is there in the industry to make sure that if you do go into an area that does have housing, does have schools nearby, we see this a lot in Houston, where industry, because of our lack of zoning, industry can open up, right across the street from an elementary school. And
yeah.
How important is it to the industry now to have that community engagement in good faith?
I think it's very important, and I think it's one of the things that the industry has started to embrace, a different model for how we're going to do community engagement. And that's one of the things I think the hubs projects and DOE, frankly, with their community benefits program has really, sort of moved the needle, if you will, because now companies are thinking about, where do they put these plants? How do they site them? How do they get the communities engaged in it? What are the benefits to some of these communities that really have been shut out of this industry and haven't had the jobs or growth that they're wanting to see? And then how do we do this in a responsible way? So if you think about, for example, diesel trucks, if you can replace a lot of the emissions from diesel trucks with hydrogen fuel cells, you're going to start to see benefits from lower particulate matter and NOx emissions in some of these neighborhoods. So this is really, I think, and it is an opportunity if we can get everybody at the table, as Representative Fletcher suggested. It is one of these opportunities to create a win-win situation for everybody. There's really something in it for communities. There's something in it for industry. There's something in it for the planet. And so that's kind of the vision that we're taking to this. We have to bring everybody along on this journey, otherwise we're not going to be successful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we're just about running out of time, but just lastly, you recently transitioned into this role focusing on hydrogen specifically at the Center for Houston's Future. But speaking of the future of Houston, CHF has a Houston 2050 plan goal. Can you kind of just give us a little tease about what that's like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the center was created 25 years ago by an entrepreneur named Gene Vaughn, who recently passed away, with this idea of being the organization solely dedicated to looking at the future of the Houston region. And so that is the vision that we have. When I came to the center 7 years ago, it was with this idea of, kind of transitioning Houston's economy into this new energy world. And so we've accomplished that. I'm taking that work forward, and then my colleague, David Gao, who has succeeded me at the center, is building a new set of work on thinking about a vision for where Houston needs to go in a lot of other areas. It could be in health equity, for example. It could be in transit. We want to think and then really get everybody in the community, folks in this room, involved in this idea of thinking about what our community looks like over the next 20 years and then try to build that. And so we see lots of really interesting things going on that can be scaled, and we're looking for those ideas, for what people's ideas are to join us in this journey of thinking about what the future of the Houston region might hold. So that's what we're doing at the Center for Houston's Future, and I'm really happy that David was willing to take on this challenge and think about these big picture things while I sort of focus on this one activity, which is trying to make Houston a global leader in clean hydrogen.
Perfect. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks. All right. And again, please subscribe to Axios Houston if you have not yet. It's a very, very worthy of your time read. Thank you all for showing up. Hope you have a good day.